turn it over to you, Ida, and thanks for all the work of putting it together, and all of you that are joining us on Zoom and on Facebook Live. Welcome. It's good to have you here. Thanks, Ida. Take it away.
Thanks, Jud. And I always say it's not work if it's fun. It doesn't feel like it. So, I'm super excited about today's conversation on tackling unconscious bias. But first, I wanted to say that Boardroom Buddhas, this space was created, like Jud said, in the effort to raise corporate consciousness, but more specifically to improve dialogue, collaboration, and the responsiveness needed to raise the effeminate wisdom in everywhere. Okay, so that's the goal of Boardroom Buddhas. We're having conversations that affect folks regardless of what their workspaces look like. Jud, who you've heard from, he's the executive director for IPP. IPP has been doing really, really, really good stuff locally. I happened to come across a call online, listening in on a discussion, and I was hooked. I volunteered some hours to IPP, and today is a result of that. So, and then Sarah, I met on one of these calls as well, and we very much resonated in terms of how we would want to empower women, period, and just create an equal playing field out there. And so in that resonance, you know, we bring content like this to you. About our panelists, Priya, who describes herself as a CEO, a mother, a wife, and a rebel who has found her cause. If that doesn't rock you, I don't know what does. That calls for attention right there. But I met Priya. She's a personal friend of mine a couple of years ago in Cincinnati. She is heading up her one-man show called Consultant on the Go. And boy, does this girl go. She's everywhere. Doing this great work in corporations, in organizations, with people one-on-one, in workshops. I've attended one of her workshops, and I used to think I'm pretty open-minded, but in that session with Priya, I thought, oh my gosh, so even I, right, we all do have this unconscious bias that constantly vibrates just under the surface with all of us. Priya and I had a great conversation. We thought this is a topic that's very relevant, and she recommended our other panelist, Stephanie Tolan, who I am just now meeting as well. Welcome, Stephanie.
Yes, I had a similar experience with Priya. So once you think you've got it together, and then one day with Priya, and it's all broken open.
I know.
It's going to be a good hour.
She tends to lift the veil very well for folks.
That's right.
So I'm excited to get going, guys. We've got 5 questions that's going to help guide us and keep us straight, and that's part of Sarah's job. When I get too excited about a topic I love, I tend to drift. So Sarah's going to keep us straight, and I'm going to sort of hand it over to her.
Thank you, Ida. I am so glad to be here with you guys today. And thanks again to Jud and IPP for letting us have this platform for these discussions. I think we should just jump right in. I'm excited to hear from you ladies. We have another great, amazing panel this week. And last week's conversation was amazing. This week is going to be, I have a feeling, even better. The more we get into these conversations, I think the richer they get. So let's just jump in. Let's let these ladies loose. So we'll start with the first question. So if it's referred to as unconscious bias, how can one possibly address what one cannot be conscious of? Priya, would you like to start that one off?
You and me.
I would love to start that one off. Yes, and I think that's a big question that most of us are often faced with when we start learning about the fact that we have biases. I look at this work very holistically. So to me, if it's unconscious and you don't know you have it, are you open to recognizing that there are things that are around you that you don't know, or that you don't know you do, or beliefs you have that show up in your behavior? And I think this is where that holistic piece of being balanced and mindful and being centered is key. Because if you operate from your ego and you believe you have everything figured out, and what you do, what you know, how you show up is all in alignment, then when I tell you, you may have an unconscious bias or an unconscious preference to a group of people, to a certain race, to a certain generation, whatever it might be, you're going to push back because your ego is going to come into play and say, no, I don't. I'm in control. I know everything I do. So I think the first part of it is being open to recognizing that we as human beings operate from our autopilot more than we do from our conscious mind. And then just being willing to learn more about where your behaviors come from.
Yeah. I would add to that, because it is unconscious, that's a great question. How do you know? I like to think about it in terms of when something makes you scratchy, right? So when you have this sense of like something about this doesn't feel quite right, whether you are in an environment that you haven't been in, or you're reading something new, or you've heard something for the first time, and it just is kind of scratchy, like you're trying to process through it, but something doesn't seem to connect with what you've known to be true before. That scratchiness to me is an opportunity to get curious. And what is it about that makes me scratchy? Why can I not reconcile the four? Is that a new idea? What does it mean to me? How does it affect how I show up every single day? That, I think, is one way to start to plug into the things that might be unconscious, is just when you have that kind of cognitive dissonance. You're sitting in a meeting and someone says something and you're like, ooh, I don't think so, right? And it's something that gets you, get your attention and allows you to start to become curious about why that didn't connect with you.
I've got a follow-up question, a small question that's going to piggyback on what the both of you just said in terms of, one, is it fair to say that not all unconscious bias is necessarily negative? And two, as humans, we tend to, when we get that scratchy feeling, we tend to think that the scratchy feeling is caused by something out here in the environment that's seen or sensed or felt or heard, right? We tend to immediately then look at the environment and say, there's a fault somewhere out here, and not realize perhaps that it is an unconscious bias inside of us that is creating that scratchy feeling. What do you both have to say on that?
Yeah. So for me, when I think about that scratchy feeling, it's easier to look externally because then I don't have to do any work, right? If I can look outside and come up with a reason for it, then certainly it's not about me, which is the genesis. That's what we're talking about, unconscious bias, right? So that we're kind of naturally wired to keep ourselves safe and protected in that way. And even in our own internal discussions, that shows up like that. And so the natural instinct, I do believe, is to look outside and say, well, that's about them, or that's about this scenario, or to come up with a reason to explain it away that does not mean that I have to reflect differently on the way that I think about the world or the way that I think about that situation. So starting to notice those patterns of behavior, I think, are pretty important too. Priya, what do you think?
Oh, I'm definitely in agreement. And to me, to your point, this is where I tie it back to the ego, right? Because we have been taught that we use ourselves as the benchmark of the world around us, right? So if I'm okay with something, if you're not okay with it, it's really your problem, because, I'm okay with it. What's wrong with you? And when we look at it through that lens, we truly look at it as someone else's issue. And if it's not real to me, it can't be real. If I haven't experienced it, it can't be a real experience. And I think that's part of, as we think about, Ida, to your point around unconscious bias being positive or negative, there is, bias in itself, in its simplistic form, is a shortcut that our brain creates to be able to survive and thrive. Is just what we do. It's biology. It's not an excuse, but it's biology at play. So we may have some conscious biases that we react to, just like if you're driving your car and you hear, a ambulance behind you or a fire engine behind you. We all have a quick shortcut that says, get out of the way. right? They're going somewhere, it's an emergency, get out of the way. It's a shortcut, it's a bias. Unconscious biases are the ones we don't know about. And so the question becomes is, some unconscious biases might be designed to keep us safe, where you react without thinking. So again, you're walking on the street, you see a car that's coming across the road, it's coming really fast. You don't stop to see if that driver looks friendly or are they smiling at you. Your instinct, natural instinct, is to jump out of the way so you don't get hit. Right? You're not thinking, it's not a long-term conversation in your head. So that, I would say, is a good unconscious bias, if I want to judge it, because that keeps you safe. But an unconscious bias when it comes to other decision-making could be negative with certain groups of people.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that unconscious bias could either keep you safe or it can get you stuck. And when it gets you stuck is where you come up against the why. Now, do we have the presence of mind and the mindfulness or the space within ourselves to actually, one, recognize it when we get to that stucky place, and then do self-inquiry as to the why behind it? What are your thoughts?
Very well put. Yeah, absolutely. It's that piece around our comfort zone. Because the second, to Stephanie's, I love her, makes you scratchy. I love that analogy, because the second I start feeling scratchy, I'm saying to myself internally, what do I need to do to stop feeling scratchy?
Or what is it that makes me feel scratchy?
Well, I don't even know what it is, because I want it to stop. And I'm not the problem. So I need to fix the scratchy. I'm not interested really in this moment to even figure out the what. I just want to, is it the grass that's making me scratchy? Do I need, what do I need? And then again, it's not that I want to find the solution often, because I may choose not to. And that's part of why I think there's such a negative perception with the conversation of bias.
All right, let's take it to the next level.
Let's do it.
Conversation. So let's apply a practical day-to-day example of how one might run up against a scratchy moment and so forth. So as a woman walking into a business environment, which let's say is typically seen as a male-dominant environment, what as a woman should I be aware of in terms of the conditioned concepts in my mind to the role of woman in this male-dominated environment?
Steph, you want to kick us off?
Oh, I got something for this one. So I think a big component of it is understanding that it is a framework and determining how you want to play with that bias, right? So if it is a heavily male-dominated space, do you want to perform, perfect, and please in that space in order to be successful? Or do you want to engage counter to that in order to be successful? One of them is a safe way to show up. The other one's a little riskier. So a lot of times what I see is really subtle ways that this shows up in the workplace. And it's things like the woman in the room being asked to take notes, or to go to the whiteboard to keep notes. It's the woman in the room being asked to plan the team outing. It's the woman in the room who cleans the kitchen just because that's part of her habit. So those little tiny things, we're all bringing that bias. And when someone says, will you take notes? And you go, okay, sure. My advice is never take the note. Never fill the coffee machine. Never wipe the counter. Because those are the things that are that happen outside of work that are also brought into work. And those biases are perpetuated in little things like that. There's probably a bigger story, Priya, that you have behind that, but that's definitely how I see it show up in just very tiny ways.
I think that's the perfect story when we look at it through that feminine lens. And to me, I want to take it back out for just a second, is where does that come from? right? That's part of that cultural programming that we all get from an early age. You know, girls do certain things, boys do certain things, and there are certain norms that are set, and we don't even realize, to Stephanie's point, we are operating from those shortcuts that each of us has. So even though we may think, or we may know and believe that, you know, we are in corporate America, I'm the leader, I'm running the meeting, I may naturally fall into a support role because that's so innate in me that I'm not even recognizing it.
Yeah.
And you know, I often, when I work with in the corporate world, I often like to look at the leadership structure. And I love to see the C-suite, to really look at how many women are in the C-suite, but what roles do they have? You know, and we'll notice a lot of organizations, again, unconscious bias at play, will have women, you know, if they do have women at that C-suite level, will have women in administrative, you know, so the HR role or administrative services role. Women traditionally are not running your businesses, right? Those are not conscious decisions. You know, leaders don't sit and say, oh yeah, she's a woman, she shouldn't be running operations, or she shouldn't be running marketing. It's just how those decision making kind of gets impacted at a very subconscious level.
Mm-hmm.
Gosh, this is interesting stuff. Judd, I know you've got something to say. You may.
Well, this is from the men's work with specifically relating to women, that I think in working with men and helping them uncover unconscious bias, specifically towards women, some of the work has to do with going back and looking at our what's called your internalized mother imago. So it has to do with, how did I understand my relationship with my mother? How did I relate to her? And then also your sisters. So we look at family systems dynamics. Those assumptions about who women are, what they should do, are often pulled from those. And so from men, really need to go back and ask the question, am I relating to other women the way I expected my mother or wanted my mother to relate to me, or my sisters? And that's where they can begin to get at that knot and the assumptions they make about who women are, that then become, and I think we have to be careful here, because also there's the sexualization of the feminine by the masculine, which in one way served us biologically, right? Because immediately when we see a woman, there is a biological tendency to relate to her in our primal brain from will she make a good mate? You know, is she going to be, will she carry my children well, right? And so what men have to be careful to do is to know that those things emerge in us, those feelings, those thoughts. And we can't shadow them, right? They can't be repressed, because if they get repressed, they come out in negative ways. So what we can do is know that we're having these thoughts. We know we're having these feelings. We know that we may bring in these assumptions about their role, and then we take responsibility for them. We bring them into conscious. We don't repress them. We don't shadow them. We bring them into conscious. I'm relating to this person the way I related to my mother. That's not my mother. I better not do that. You know, this is not a partner, a sexual object for me. This is a colleague. I may have attraction to them, but I can acknowledge that, and then I can respond out of my neocortex, which is able to say, wow, this is another person that has thoughts, feelings, experiences, stories, and I need to learn how to honor that and then relate to them as a colleague. So I think in men's work, it's important not to shadow those unconscious bias. And you're not a bad person because you feel that way, but you do need to take responsibility for it and express it in a way that's healthy. That's just my 2 pieces.
So I'd like to bring the female perspective to that, Judd, in saying, and by piggybacking what Stephanie mentioned earlier about how we tend to, just as women, we are nurturers by nature, right? We tend to take care of those around us and grow people and so forth, and teams. So it's also important not to shadow that part of who we are as women in workplaces. So yes, you are going to feel the urge to wash the 3 cups of empty, half-empty coffees sitting on the sink. It's going to bug you because, I mean, you know, we women. But to be able to bring it to consciousness and say, oh, that's bugging me. And if I do these 3 cups, there better not be any cups when I come back at 4 because I'm not doing. So you have this conversation going, right? And it's a clear space of making a conscious decision.
Yeah.
Right? As opposed to coming up to the 3 cups standing there and start these stories in your head about, I'm always doing this. They think that because I always do it, that it's my job, blah, 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 right? So again, just bringing and not shadowing that part of who we are as women, regardless of what place we play in, right? Whether it's the workspace or with our friends or with our families at home. So I think it's important to note that is in flow too.
And I would add to that, I think that's an excellent perspective, to be very cognizant of those activities and whether or not they are actually benefiting you. And if they benefit you because they serve that part of your soul, because that's how you want to show up and serve, that's an excellent lens. One of the things that I observe in my own life, as well as with some other women that I work with, is, let's go back to that note-taking example. All of a sudden, note-taking, when it was me with a group of my peers, put me back in an image from the 1950s with the woman who was the secretary, who actually wasn't at the same level. And so I actually believed that I started to do it because I was trying to be helpful to the rest of the team. But what I observed over time was that there was this subtle understanding that I was less than because I did that work, right? And so that's when something like that becomes a barrier to your career and to the way that you're trying to move forward, is how are you showing up? So even if it started in service, sometimes the shadow side of that can actually have a negative impact on your credibility because of the unconscious bias that comes with that type of activity or that type of role.
Absolutely. Anything to add to that, Ms. Priya?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with everything that's been shared, and it's back to Judd's point. As we're looking at it through the kind of the masculine lens, I think that's part of the combination, because when women come into the workplace and assume more of those masculine behaviors or competencies, then that comes with its own perceptions on how a woman is labeled. So Judd, I so appreciate you kind of highlighting, right? Men need to do this work internally as much as women need to, because we are all living from, as you call it, I mean, I look at it as we are all living from our collective programming, right? We are all programmed from an early age, and we live these out, whether it's how we saw our moms, how we saw our fathers, how we saw our, the elders around us. And then we don't realize it because at that unconscious level, we are kind of repeating those cycles and those patterns. And I think as you talk about that awareness, at least what I've experienced is, having these conversations with men and women together and separately, I think the first step of the process that is often hard to get through is just the acknowledgement that this exists. We all have this programming, and it's not a judgment of good or bad. It's how does it show up, and then how are you overcompensating? So to Stephanie's point, not taking notes. I am very conscious in certain environments where I will let my male characteristics stick out even more, because I know I'm in that environment. And if I show my feminine side of service, it looks like as a weakness, right? So I overcompensate.
Fantastic. I mean, very, very good point to make. This just is walking us right into that next question we had lined up. Could this be the thing that creates this confidence gap in the workplace between men and women? We know that, and I put a blurb in there, that we still for every dollar that a man earns, this is as of the end of 2019, women are making 79 cents to the dollar that man earns. So with that obvious discrepancy in place, would you say that it's how we are showing up that is affecting that confidence gap that we all are experiencing as women?
I would think there's definitely a correlation. And what I personally find fascinating in having conversations around equity specifically is, when you bring it up, it's hard to pinpoint and get to the fact that men and women in the same role are not doing the same amount of job or producing the same amount of results. But when it comes to the compensation conversation, we are going back to those innate programming insights that say women are supporting. I often hear leaders say, well, she really doesn't need a raise. And research, by the way, shows this as well. When women have babies, I'll use that example. When women have babies, and they go out on maternity leave, their salary takes a hit, right? Their careers take a hit because they're gone for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever they can afford to take. Whereas in the corporate world, data shows us that men get a baby bonus. Because the perception is, again, through that unconscious lens, is that, whoa, he's a father now. He has 2 mouths to feed, right? Whereas for the woman, she's having a baby, she's out of the workforce, but her husband is supporting her. Yeah. And so that's part of that, as you call it, the confidence gap. I think that's part of, till we don't start re-examining those beliefs in some ways and start looking at actual output and work produced, we are going to continue to see that inequity, specifically when it comes to salary.
Yeah, I definitely think that there are systemic reasons that is true, right? Most of it based on these biases that we're talking about. I also think that there's work to do for us as women to be conscious of how we are playing into those unconscious biases. So are we continuing to perpetuate that in the work that we do? How are we actually showing up? So fixing the system isn't going to fix the problem unless we are showing up. And that means showing up as our full selves. So when we can show up in that way and be counterculture, and bring all of the feminine to the table, where we build relationships and we collaborate and we build on one another and we do that kind of work, that actually can drive revenue for the business, can drive innovation, can drive the things that a lot of that pay is based on, right? So if we don't bring all of ourselves to that work, we also are starting to perpetuate that and penalize ourselves. So I think it's both things. I think there's obviously a giant system, but I think we individually can do something about it by understanding how we show up as women in the workplace.
Fascinating. Sarah, what's coming up for you listening in on this?
Well, I was just thinking when Stephanie was saying that and Ida, what you mentioned before about, that being a natural instinct for women to come in and almost kind of mother people around them in the workplace. That we have to make a conscious choice. First of all, examine why we want to do that. But second, we have to make a conscious choice to set clear boundaries of what we're going to do and what we're not going to do in a workplace. We're not going to take notes. We're not going to make coffee, clean the kitchen, all those types of things. And I think it's hard when you're first starting out in a career to have those boundaries because you don't have your confidence yet. You almost have to be taught those things. So, but as we age and have more wisdom and more confidence in who we are, I think it's easier to set those boundaries, especially when you go up into management leadership positions. I clearly am not going to do this in this scenario at all, and that's just something you have to establish early on. But so a question I have is, how do we? In what ways do we train our boys and girls, our children, and like what ways have we trained our kids with these biases already, and how do we start to turn that around?
Well, it'd be great if Dad did the dishes too,
right?
And Mom mowed the yard.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's where they're going to see the biggest impact of that. So to Jed's point earlier, all of these things that we bring with us based on our parental relationships are not exclusive to life outside the workforce. It all shows up in the workforce too. So, the question is, are we leading and demonstrating what we believe to be true in terms of balance and the benefit that both men and women innately bring to a relationship for our children?
Right. Yeah, and that plays out with, the home maternity leave thing as well. How do we support women in that area? How do men step up and help? Do they take you know, as much time off to help as the women do, or, you know, how are they supporting? Are they doing more housework at home? Like, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that's a great question, because to me, to answer that, you know, how do we raise our kids? And I think part of it is, first, to influence change, we have to acknowledge that we all have unconscious biases, that we first even just have biases, because I call bias the other B word when I do this work, because in some rooms, when I use the word bias, it's like I've called everybody a name they're not happy about. So I think we have to first just acknowledge that through the lenses of biology, we all have these we may have conscious biases, conscious preferences, but then we have unconscious biases. So once we own that, we can then have these conversations with our children. We can help them understand that they have natural preferences on which friends they get along with, or they don't have as much conflict with, why they may like certain foods, whatever that might be, certain sports they care for, certain type of music they listen to. If we start to kind of plant those seeds now with our children, then that allows them to grow up recognizing that there is a yin and yang. It's not one or the other. It's that balance that we need to find. And I think that's, you know, part of it. And then that really transfers into our community. You know, what kind of shows do we watch? What kind of, how are women portrayed in some cartoons our kids are watching if we've got younger kids, or movies? What kind of commercials are we seeing? You know, I have an 11-year-old daughter, and I talk to her about body type all the time when we are watching either, you know, a commercial pops up or we are online shopping. Very conscious about that, because again, I don't want her to internalize what she looks or doesn't look like. So the more I think we bring these things to the surface, I think the better we are able to start to equip our kids to manage their biology. We're not giving them something they don't already have.
Right. Very good points. I have a 12-year-old daughter myself, and this brought a memory back. When she was 3 years old, I took her to the store to get her first tricycle. And I remember us walking down the aisle where all the bicycles were, and there were the cutest pink bikes with little baskets on them and pink ribbons dangling. I mean, I had the picture in my head of all, because I do photography. It's like, oh yeah, that's going to be perfect, like picture, right? Hallmark card in my head. And this little girl came back home with her bicycle, and it was one of those red ones with the blue handlebars. I mean, it just looked like it could go, okay? And that was what drew her, and not the pink little bike that I had in mind when we went shopping. When her dad came home that evening, he's like, what is this? Right? And I'm like leaving the space to teach that your personal preference is valid, and it's not for me to instill what looks right. Right? And so I think that's one way of walking the walk wherever you are. And then also to Sarah's earlier point with regards to, and Stephanie's, how we show up as women in a male-dominated environment. I have found I've had female bosses. Okay, now you all know where I'm going with this, where they have acclimated so much with the male way of thinking, which is what had set them up for success, because they could speak the language, they could walk the walk, they could navigate well enough to end up in a leadership position. But I have had some female bosses, y'all, that I was like, no. Right? So is there there's this place where it seems like we pull too far away from this sacred feminine that hardens our hearts a little bit too much, because we're so in the game that we've pulled away and separated from that nurturing part of who we are as women. What do you have on that?
Yeah.
You know, that what you just shared hits very close to home for me, because what that just illustrates is, again, how much social construct and our environment influences us. So even though we may say innately women are nurturers, I would still pause and question that. Are we? Or are we told from when we are young girls that we are nurturers, right? If we tell that to our young boys, maybe they will be nurturers too, right? But it's that social construct and what gets kind of programmed in us. But Ida, your example is so point on around unconscious biases, because just because they're unconscious biases, it doesn't mean that, women are at the receiving end of it or women are doing it to other men. Unconscious biases really do not discriminate. I don't think biases discriminate. And what I mean by that is women, and again, data shows us this, there are lots of studies around this, women leaders tend to have biases towards other women on their teams and be harder on their employees than they are with men. So women have more biases towards other women. Because again, part of that social construct tells us the way you move forward in your career or in life is by not taking good notes, is by portraying more of those masculine skills. And I think part of it, at least for me, is finding the balance. And again, recognizing when to leverage the masculine side and when to leverage the more feminine side. And figuring out that balance. And I think that's the piece. It's different for everyone, but till you don't even know you're doing it, how do you get there?
Yeah. Right. Howard's ready to jump in. I was waiting. And he was so well behaved too.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. Now,
I mean, I love this conversation, and I there's virtually nothing that I disagree with here, although I have arrived through different literature. Big deal. The point I was hoping to just throw into the pot is the idea that masculinity and femininity, and I'm defining them as being how much sex stereotype preference and behavior a person enjoys or does. So masculinity and femininity are separate entities. So you can have a person, regardless of their gender, who is strongly masculine or strongly feminine or strongly both, or weak in either or both, regardless of their gender. So what I heard you say, Ida, is that certain women who succeed in rising to power in corporate situations are strongly masculine and perhaps more weakly feminine in how much sexual stereotype behavior and attitudes they demonstrate. The literature that was originally done on this by Sandra Lipschitz, she created the BEM Sexual Inventory, suggested that the folks that are the most adaptable and the most functional in the most wide variety of environments are strong in both, regardless of gender. You know, people who come in with a strong feminine, whether they're male or female, and a strong female, whether they're male or female, are the most adaptable, the most empathic, the most flexible. So I'm sorry, I think I've taken too much time.
No, not at all.
No, I think that's a great point that you bring up. I would say, for me, I think I show up strongly both ways. And here's how that showed up in my career. So very early on, one of the jobs that I took, we had to take a personality profile. And this was way back in the day where they did a lot of psychological testing. And when I walked in for my debrief, the individual who was debriefing me said, "Oh, I'm really surprised to see you. Your profile looks like you're a 55-year-old man." So they were shocked to see me in my, late 20s showing up here, right? So there was this really, and it was designed around all of the very traditional business architectures. What I figured out how to do, though, and one of the things I think that people that are balanced in both are able to do, is how to leverage that to support the feminine side as well. So for me, those behaviors of showing up as very assertive, of being very action oriented, of being able to make decisions, resulted in me building a women's network inside the business and bringing other women along with me. And then we all got on the train. We're all doing the thing, right? So all of those feminine skills of relationship building and collaboration, the masculine and the feminine balance themselves out there, because it was the traditional masculine behaviors that generated the energy to develop the feminine network inside the business. So I think it's important to think about how both of those things can play out for each individual that you're working with.
Priya, looks like you're thinking there, the cogs are turning.
I'm taking in what Howard and Stephanie just shared, and I concur. I think, as we are having this conversation, I feel like we are open to this discussion and recognizing that it's yin and yang. It's not one or the other.
Yeah.
As I look at it through the lenses of corporate America, broad stroke, and I think about the messaging that's sent to us as, how do we define leadership? How do leaders look? How do leaders show up? How do leaders behave? We are somewhat coached towards one way of being a leader. And it's a broad stroke, right? So I'm not saying it's all, and it's not a stereotype, but traditionally, that's why there's so much research done around the quiet leader versus the loud leader, and who's really producing and who's really leading, and the empathetic leader. And I think part of it is we have this discussion. I think it's key to accept and acknowledge that there is a diversity of belief on what leadership looks like. And I think, to Howard's point, I completely agree. It's not really tied to our sex from a binary perspective, but at the same time, those social constructs start to shape those behaviors, right? I've always been loud. I've always been assertive. And I've had lots of labels put on me before that, right? And so the key is, can I own those labels without letting it impact my confidence? Or do I want to fit in to the groups that I may belong to, and then I start behaving more like them? And I think that's where that individual free will empowerment comes into play. On how do you lead others through that conversation and letting them find their center, whatever that center might be for them.
So I have this, I don't know what to call it, a theory in our current circumstances, what that is doing to us in terms of how we are thinking about the navigating of life. Is I feel that during this whole pandemic lockdown space that we've all been in, it has allowed us to revisit those scratchy, feely places, right? And so I don't even want to use the word hope, because hope means that I'm looking into the future where change lies. I'm certain change is happening as we are speaking. And I think we can all resonate with that regardless of gender. Because workplaces have changed. The boardroom has now become the screen, right? We are having richer conversations, deeper conversations, past the surface level stuff, past the policy book and the handbooks. Yes, those things are still in play, but they're not priority anymore. And having said all of that, hence Boardroom Buddhas, right? Hence this concept of creating this platform where we want those leaders like yourself, Priya, like yourself, Stephanie and Howard, to have this platform to say it's balanced. There's no wrong or right. It is what it is. With the sum of all our experiences, where do we go to from here, right? So now that we are here, let's catch up. But we're here now. What would you say? Three things. Give me three things that I can do as a woman in the space that I'm in right now, regardless of what that space may look like. What are three things I can do that's going to sort of help me go in and ask myself those questions to start cooking?
Steph, you want to kick us off?
Yeah. One of the things that I think we should spend some time with is what it means to go back. And may we never go back to what it meant to be a professional in the workplace. And for you as a woman, how did you show up, right? So I think what's interesting in this conversation is the work from home has enabled us to see the humanity in the people that we work with, regardless of gender. Yeah. You know, it's the toddler in the background, and we're sharing each other's dogs and cats, and right, all of these things have happened because we're human beings. And at the crux of it, let's stay there. And I think there's something about what the sacred feminine can bring to this space that can pull that thought through and keep it in, right? So can you be the one that asks how your kid is doing, how someone else's kid is doing? Can you be the one who asks if they took their dog Rusty out for a walk, right? Can you be the one that keeps that as a part of the conversation, even when you might physically be back in the office? If that feels authentic to you, that is one of those things that I think that we can start doing that is a silver lining from this whole situation, that we've learned more about who we are as human beings. And so that's definitely one of the things that I think women are uniquely positioned to help continue to foster. And then also the sense that, you know, people are struggling with different things now, right? So whether it's financially, whether it's things with childcare, whether it's things, just anxiety about being out in the world, this is where that natural empathy and that natural ability to develop relationships can make the difference between someone feeling like they're included and part of your business and cared for and not. And so it is a real opportunity, I think, for women to start to distinguish ourselves by using what might come naturally to us. And again, I don't want to leave the guys out of this, right? So it is that sacred feminine. It is that component that says, I care about you, right? I care for you. And that shows up in the way that we work together too. So those are a couple of things I can think about.
Those are powerful. Thank you. You know, so as at least I put on that corporate lens for 30 seconds, as I reflect on that 3 things we can do practically. I think organizationally, within an organization, within an individual sphere of influence, I think it's looking at the behaviors that we are rewarding in our system, right? So if you're a leader within an organization and you have a team of 5 or 10 or 2, what behaviors do you appreciate and reward? And how does that come into play as we look at this dichotomy between the male, the masculine, and the feminine? And then how do we even just define leadership? Because, you know, to Stephanie's point, I think what's critical here is because we have attached judgment to behaviors. You know, men can't cry, men shouldn't worry about families and dogs, and men shouldn't care about that stuff. We've trained men, in essence, to not even go there, even if they want to. We've asked them to suppress that side, right? Because it doesn't look leadership-like. It doesn't look like you're a strong leader. But we've asked women to step up and portray more of those masculine characteristics. So I think, you know, it's how do organizations, or how do you as a leader define leadership? Again, tying it back to those behaviors. And then, you know, part of it is just having the open dialogue and conversation around the fact that, again, we need the balance. To Stephanie's point, we are human beings here having a human experience. Yes, we're running businesses and operations and, you know, P&Ls and all that good stuff, but we're still in the business of people as leaders. So how do we not forget that? And how do we make it okay for men to show up, maybe showing a little bit more of that caring and that feminine side? And I'll still question it and say, innately, I think if that programming gets put in soon enough, there's no reason men can't be caring. I know a lot of men that are so caring, but our environment has taught them not to act like they care. Yeah. And that's the part I feel why I'm a rebel, right? Because I want to keep pushing that and saying, question your social construct, question the social construct. But that's my 2 cents for now.
Great stuff, people. I'm going to open it up to the rest of the Zoom callers and those who might be listening in on Facebook. If you have any questions or comments, or you want to throw something else in the pot, we are totally open and welcome those. I'm looking at Stephanie and Priya and Sarah. in terms of just women who looks like to me have it figured out in terms of that balance.
Oh, Steph, we didn't give him the real story.
We,
Oh no. Oh no.
wow. Okay.
I think I'm not wrong, but just from just this conversation and other conversations I've had with Priya and Sarah specifically, you know, it's women are juggling. We've just been thrown back into all those roles. We are managing the business or the workspace that we've been in for however long. And at the same time, we've become cooks again and cleaners and homeschoolers, and there's kids at home, right? And so there's all this other stuff happening all at the same time, which the three of you, to me, looks like you managing that very well. So we have a conversation coming up next Wednesday, again, on Boardroom Buddhas, that's going to talk to those different hats we wear and keeping all these balls juggled up in the air and making it work. So just sharing some tips and tools in your backpacks that help you through it, you know. But it's going to specifically come from your place of faith. How does faith play a role in terms of how you show up, regardless of what hat you may be wearing at the time? So just putting that out there.
Grace, lots of grace is required for all of that, the shifting of the hats.
So Judd, did you want to add something to the conversation? I'm putting you a bit on the spot. Howard, please feel free. Carol, Kathy, Melanie, Linda, whoever else is on the call, feel free to share some thoughts. What's coming up for you?
What was coming up for me was back to these, how do we invite children into their own sense of wholeness and identifying however they want to, and not these heavy social constructs around gender. And some of the work that I think needs to happen culturally is we're finding that there are uninitiated healthy masculine energy, so that we have lost rites of passage. I think women are doing a better job of that, initiating women into the fullness of their, however they would identify as female or male. But I think men are lagging behind in that. So a lot of the men's work is how do we initiate young men into healthy masculinity that doesn't buy into all of these assumptions either. And I think what we find is that, again, I think this is the similarity between what's white people's work, what's black people's work, what's our work, and then the question of what is people who identify as masculine, people who identify as feminine, what's the different work that we have. And I think some of the work culturally we have to do is how to help young men understand the fullness of who they are and embrace the fullness of who they are and initiate them into that and not initiate them into these unhealthy forms of masculinity. That would be my only piece. Anybody else, you're welcome to unmute yourself or raise your hand and I can unmute you.
I really appreciate the use of the word balance. That's been really important. And I would say my experience has been, as I've explored all the various ways that I can contribute in wherever I am, I go to asking, what can I offer that brings us closer to balance? So if we're in a heavy masculine weighted environment, can I bring my feminine into that to offer a little bit more balance? And I would say the same things with Myers-Briggs and any of those kinds of things that tend to show binary, single pole, double pole continua. If we can move the balance to the middle, create greater balance, I find that things work better for everybody.
Mr. Greg, did you have a comment? You'd unmuted yourself there. Love to bring you into the conversation.
I just want to thank you all. This is impressive work that everybody is involved with. but two things strike me as one, it constantly reminds me of corporate organizations, but oftentimes many people that aren't really confident how they're doing it. And discussions like this naturally lead to training programs, discussions in the work environment. And this goes back to my experience in the 80s in the corporate world. But I want to also just remind you that one bias that we haven't touched on today that affects all of your work is that we live in a monoculture, a massive monoculture. I mean, as a business person, Americans were frequently criticized for just trying to get to the nuts and bolts, to the real facts. You know, why am I here? Why did I fly across oceans to meet with you, etc. And they were people would be depressed that we would not want to establish a personal relationship first.
Yeah.
Middle Eastern cultures and Dravidian cultures that I've dealt with, they want you to become part of their family.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if it was before Priya, but this comment of asking, how is your family? How is your dog? How are your children doing? What are your anxieties? And this really hit upon me when I first got to go to Brazil in the 1980s. I used to be an international attorney and making joint ventures all over the globe. And when I got there, the guy says, Brazil has the same problem America has. We are so large geographically that nothing is spilling across our borders. We do not get exposed to other media, other cultures. We only speak one language, et cetera, et cetera. And most of us have had this experience. You go to Europe and there are 7 or 8 languages constantly thrumming upon you with advertising, with radio, with television, with product names and stuff like that. Americans have just have this bias towards being simple. And unfortunately, its worst expression is being ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of our social issues today about social justice, tolerance, improving our systemic governance and things like that results from just too much of that constantly repeated and magnified by mass media.
Mm-hmm.
But I admire your thinking. This I kind of stumbled into this because I'm looking at all of this from a personal perspective as a Buddhist and preparing for a retreat next week. And so the whole idea of bias fascinated me.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for letting me sit in.
Absolutely. And if I could, to your point, I think that's so true when you talk about where we are socially in this country. You know, I think my humble opinion through the lenses of diversity and equity, this country has pushed for that monoculture approach mindset for the last 60, 70, 80 years. And with the changing demographics, changing beliefs, changing mindset, all of that stuff, the push is coming to be more global, to be more multicultural mindset. And I think that's part of what we are seeing today as we are kind of standing at that tipping point of where do we go with race in our country? Where do we go with these conversations around inequities, to Ida's earlier point around what men make versus what women make in this country as compared to other countries. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a direct correlation. And that's why, to me, at least for me, as I do this work, I tie it so much to culture. Because if you are raised in a monocultural mindset or approach that our culture is the only culture, I'll be silly for 30 seconds. You know, if I was taught that UK was the only team to bleed blue for, then if I tell you I went to Xavier University, you're not going to like my blue because my blue is not the right blue. As silly as that example sounds, but it's a monocultural mindset. Right? So thank you for bringing that to the table. And I grew up in India, so I completely get it. I'm an immigrant in this country like Ida is. And so I completely get that we need to change that perspective.
I love that this has come up because it's a perfect time for me to plug yet another talk that's lined up for Boardroom Buddhas. Is this I would like to have as many women to share, who are immigrants like myself, to share their experience coming into this culture. I mean, I specifically remember I had culture shock for 2 years, to a point, very real experience, to a point where I said to my then husband, it's either we go back home or we start a family. How's that for a threat? Right? That's where I was at 2 years in this culture, where it was just so hard to find a fit. And I think that would speak to exactly your point, Greg, is that we still have a lot of growing to do in terms of encompassing that part of the discussion, right, within ourselves. Yeah. I see that our chat box looks busy. Or we had some folks jump off because they needed to be somewhere else. I'm going to ask, is there anything else that we might want to throw in here and talk about? If not, then we will do the...
I've got a couple of things I want to talk about, like the spiritual practice. Greg, I want to thank you for bringing in that kind of concept that you got into the conversation around the Buddha piece. And I think this is really where spiritual practice is important, specifically Buddhist practice. Well, I have this idea that my soul is androgynous, and that it's always inviting me, as Howard said, into understanding and knowing the fullness of who I am, including whatever we would identify as masculine and feminine traits. And so as I move to my own soul, and if I have practices that connect me to my soul, I feel like I move into more androgyny. So it's not about, oh, I've got to take on these other characteristics. For me, it's how do I understand my wholeness, and how do I move to my wholeness? And then I don't know what all will show up there, whether that will look feminine or masculine, because in some ways it's beyond concepts, it's beyond those binaries. So I think spiritual practice that gets us in touch with our higher self or our soul, whatever language we would want to use there, is helpful in moving beyond these categories in ourselves and also in others. And then the second thing is, how does Buddhist practice of witnessing, cultivating the witness, help us? Because in all these personality profiles, like with the Enneagram, we're always talking about, do you have the capacity to watch yourself arise? And until we can witness ourselves from some objective perspective, we can't do anything about those behaviors. And so cultivating mindfulness or consciousness that allows us to witness our desires, our actions, and have a little space between them, then we can actually change those when they're not serving us. And so I think meditative or spiritual practice is really key, especially in the integration of the masculine and feminine, because we can watch ourselves and watch our programming arise. Unless you can watch your programming, you can't change it. And so I think spiritual practice is essential in that capacity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In my head, I've been plotting my path along my own spiritual journey, and I can now look back and see how the first few months, I would say, was identifying the gap, was identifying there's this personality bag of skin me that shows up. And then when I go into my meditation in the evenings for an hour, there's that part of me that shows up, creating space, right? So that gap, and practicing, okay, now I go to work as Ida, And tonight when I come home, I'm going to do Ida-ing, right? I'm going to reflect on my day, what's come up, etc. And then the next set of practices that came into play was, how do I close the gap? Because I've identified the gap. What am I doing to close that gap more and more every day? And then I found then from there, one is able to move into a place where you can embody the learned stuff, right? So now I can show up with, so in what Judd is speaking to in terms of the observer, being in the experience of something, responding as Ida would, but then also seeing how Ida arises and interacts. And it's that little gap that now is closed that you're able to navigate in the moment. But again, that's a practice of getting there first. But I do believe the first step is to identify that there is a gap. There's that you don't know what you don't know. Yeah. Before one can move from there. Any comments on that?
Awareness, balance, wholeness is kind of the it rises up.
Yeah.
And then to show up authentically as the wholeness.
I think that's.
I'm going to have to go. I'm sorry, folks.
Oh, you're fine, Alan. We're going to close off anyway here shortly. Thank you all so very much for participating. This was really good stuff. But if you need to run out, that's fine. Thank you again for the time. And gosh, Priya and Stephanie, you know I'm going to be circling back because there's so much to talk about, ladies. And I can't thank you enough because I know how many hats you are juggling right now, and to put time aside to bring this kind of dialogue to everyone is really great. So really, thank you, deep heart, to you both.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having us, and thank you for sharing all these nuggets of wisdom. I was taking copious notes, just so you know. So thank you for that, because it wasn't just giving, it was also receiving, and that's always a beautiful thing.
Yes, co-creating experience is my middle name. That's what it is all about. Thank you. Sarah, did you have any parting words before we log out? And then I'll give it over to Priya and Stephanie and then to Judd again. Sarah, any takeaways?
Yeah, I will just say, sometimes we think about all the ways that we can start to uncondition all of these things that we've learned and we've been taught. But it always, for me, goes back to doing that individual work. Like we each have to, as Judd says, we have to have a spiritual practice. We have to have a way to see ourselves. And so just, doing that work, going to coaching, doing whatever you can, mindfulness training to discover who you are and to find out why you're here on this earth, and to have that inner stillness and that confidence and purpose in your life, so that you take that wherever you go. And that shows up in the workplace, when you're interacting with other people and other women especially, and you're trying to lead them, when you're interacting with your kids. I have 2 boys and I catch myself constantly, Sarah, what are you doing? You're like reinforcing some of these beliefs with your own children. So I think we have to do the work individually first, and then that starts to spread. So thank you, ladies, so much. This was amazing. And I would love to continue this conversation in some way in the future. So
yeah, you bet. You bet. Yeah, I think as we bring this to a close, I mean, from my perspective, I would just encourage you to lean into the scratchy. So when you notice that something doesn't feel quite right, instead of trying to diminish it or put it to the side, is just ask the question, what's that about? Right? What is that about? Why did that hit me that way? I think developing that muscle is something that can serve in a little bit of the witness element of this, of like, what is that about? Makes it less personal, less about my ego. But that's how I've learned the most about myself and everybody around me. It's just leaning into that scratchy. Priya?
Leaning into the scratchy. I love that. and I will build on that. It's the leaning into the scratchy and recognizing that we are all a work in progress. none of us are fully baked. At least that's how I like to look at it, because the second I feel I got it all figured out, I realize how clueless I am. So I think the more we are able to just recognize, yes, with all the skills, all the competencies, all those amazing things that we can do, we still have work to do on ourselves. And so when we feel scratchy, it's not a ding on the fact that you're not competent or you're not good enough. It's just that you haven't finished learning yet.
I love that.
Love that.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to imply, not even a little bit, that I'm in that place. Let me tell you, the more you think you know, life is a beautiful way of slapping you up the head.
That's right.
Yes.
You got another blind spot. So I really am so grateful to all of you. Judd, I'm going to leave it to you to close us out. Thank you.
Fabulous. I just want to thank, one of the reasons, I feel so fortunate in my life that I've just been surrounded by a bunch of badass women. And so my mom's a badass. My sister was a badass. My daughter is a badass. My previous wife was a badass. But I'm just and you guys I include in that. I'm just so thankful that just really, and you understand what I mean by badass, just that whole, y'all are bringing it all. And that's so beautiful. And invites me to bring my whole self too. So I'm deeply grateful for your time and energy that you gave and the wisdom that you brought. For those of you that are watching or still on Zoom or in Facebook Live, join us tomorrow morning. We have a devotional with poetry of protest. So we use a Lectio Divina process to look at poetry, and we're specifically looking at poetry of protest. To get inspiration for that. And then tomorrow afternoon, we're doing a second part of a series on truth and reconciliation models. We're going to be specifically looking at some of the themes and elements from the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa. But there was also a process done here in Greensboro, North Carolina, back in the 90s that just finished up in the early 2000s. That we'll also be looking at, because we're trying to ask the question here locally in Louisville, what would a unique Louisville truth and reconciliation process look like for our community to move through telling the truth about who we are and who we've been, but also moving towards change and reconciliation. And are there some ways that we as a community can create a unique process? So invite you back 3 o'clock on tomorrow for another great time. So thanks to you all, and may we all go today and just be our badass selves, whatever that might look like. So, thank you all, and peace. Good to have you all with us.
Thank you.
Peace.
Thank you.
Thank you.
To everyone. Thank you so much.